What's up guys, I hope you all had a great weekend. Still no Grand Prix racing, but it's only around the corner. The second test of course coming up this week, but loads of questions coming out of last week's first test. So we're going to smash through loads of those today. So once again, time to say, roll the sting. Right, loads of questions as I said. We'll go with the first one here from Stephen Chan. And Stephen says, hi Mark, during testing when the team change driver, do the teams also change the mechanics and engineers, etc. so they can practice with each other? Best wishes, Stephen. Thanks, Stephen. So what happens is generally, no, they don't do that as a rule. What tends to happen is you've generally got two crews of mechanics and engineers, and generally, certainly with the mechanics, what will happen is you run a day shift and a night shift. We're only running one car per team, of course, so one team on the first test will be on day shift, the other crew will be on night shift, and no matter who's driving the car, that will be how it operates. Typically what will happen for the second test, those two teams will swap around and switch positions. So the team that was on day shift last week will probably be on night shift for this week. That tends to be how it works. And on a similar note, Leaf Buttleskiff asks this question. He says, do drivers during testing use the same car and swap out the seat and numbers, or do they bring multiple cars to the track? Well, again, typically they would use the same car, and that's mostly because at this stage in the season there just aren't simply enough components for the new car to build up to fully operational running cars at this point in time. So for most teams, they will use one car. They will swap the pedals, the seat, the padding, the steering wheels, and all the things that are specific to a particular driver. Change the numbers and any stickers on the side of the chassis as well for when the second driver or the other driver gets in the car. That's typically how it will work. It may be possible that next week some of the bigger teams perhaps will have enough bits, will have two cars operational, and they might like to try and get mileage on a second chassis, so that could also happen. But you've got to remember that most teams are using these 2 weeks of testing to make some final decisions on which components they want to actually run on the car. So they'll be testing back-to-back wings and things like that, and so actually the button might not be pressed on the final components that will race in Australia until after next week's test. Matthew Butcher asks this one. He says, with Williams missing 2 days of testing, can they use those 2 days later in the year? No, they can't. Unfortunately, they have just lost out on those. The rules within testing don't just say you get 8 days of testing to use whenever you want. You get 8 days to use from the official to official Formula One group tests these days. So unlike the old days when you had very little restriction, now it's heavily restricted, and unfortunately Williams have just missed out on the days that they lost. Dr. Danielson says, what equipment do teams use to download data from the F1 cars during testing? Or more broadly, how does data transfer work during pre-season testing? Well, in very much the same way that it does over a race weekend, and that is that when the car is out on track, it's constantly sending data back over a wireless network, and that network is actually set up. It's actually set up by McLaren. So McLaren Electronic Systems, who provide the ECUs for every single car on the grid, also set up a series of antennas around the circuit to create a network, a little bit like the way a mobile phone network operates. They create a localized one of those so that no matter where you are on the track, you still get coverage to one of those antennas that then beams that encrypted information back to the pit lane. Teams will also have their own version, so some teams now use a Wi-Fi, quite advanced and quite a high power Wi-Fi network, and that really comes into play, or can really be a benefit when the car comes into the pit lane, because in days gone by you would have to wait to get the car back into the pit lane to plug it in with what we called an umbilical cord. Great big cable plugged into the side of the car, and then you'd get all of the data downloaded from the car. It used to take quite a bit of time to do that, and some of the engineering decisions couldn't be made until all of that data has been sucked out of the car, loaded onto the system, and then analysed. The wireless network around the circuit only beams back certain information, certain critical sensor information, not the bulk of all of the data. So you only get that when the car comes back to the pits, and this Wi-Fi network that some teams are now developing can operate, or can start transferring at quite a high speed from a reasonable distance away. So when the car comes into the pit lane, for example, you can start this very high powered, I think it's 60 gigahertz Wi-Fi transfer, which means that by the time the car gets to the garage, you've already got a huge chunk of the bulk of the data onto your system, if not all of it. They will all still plug in an umbilical cord just to be sure in case there's any breakdown in that coverage as a backup system, and some teams are still reliant on that. But it's a much quicker way of getting the data from the car and into the garage network and into the systems to be analysed if we can do it as the car's approaching the pit lane. Of course, at a race situation that becomes even more critical because you're using that data to help make strategic decisions that may even make a difference to what tyres you put on in the pit stop, for example. So there are lots of ways, all wireless or mostly wireless, but some very clever areas. Some teams like Mercedes are linked up with Qualcomm, who are very advanced in the wireless data transfer industry and marketplace, and they're using that as a competitive advantage now, because the quicker they can get that data out of the car and into the garage, the quicker they can make those crucial decisions. So it really is a race in that area as much as it is on anything else technical around the car too. Andy Curtis says, "Hi Mark, I've been watching testing the last 3 days and I'm a bit curious to know where Merc are. They seem very quiet, nobody's talking a lot about them, and they're not lighting the timing screens up. Are they just quietly going about their job or a bit worried?" Well, I touched on this recently, didn't I? Mercedes, listen, I love the way that Mercedes approach modern Grand Prix racing. They don't go around shouting from the rooftops about what they're going to achieve. They are very humble despite their success. They're very contained, they keep things methodical. They're very open and honest, I think, at times when things haven't gone well, and about how they deal with that. And I think that's how they approach testing. They don't really want to start making any bold claims. They don't want to start banging in the fastest lap times they can do in the first week, because as we're doing with Ferrari right now, people are already talking about Ferrari as being absolute favourites, and Mercedes don't want to pile that pressure on themselves. So they absolutely have a different approach, and they will have been working on lots of different things last week as opposed to ultimate lap time. We saw this very much last year, didn't we? And yet we get to the first races and bang, they're on it, and and very much favourites for the title, I guess. However, having said that, as I also mentioned in some of the previous videos, there are a few signs to me like they're not entirely comfortable. I don't think they're worried, but I don't think they're entirely comfortable. And that, again, is not something that any Mercedes fan should be concerned with at this point, because we've only had 4 days of testing, and that's what testing's about. It's about understanding your car, knowing how to get the best out of it, how to unlock its potential, and that is not always something that comes immediately. So I don't think anyone needs to be worried. I don't think we need to be concerned. I think if we get to the end of next week and we're still seeing some slightly concerned or less than comfortable looks and words coming out of Mercedes, then you might start asking a few more questions. But at this point, I don't think there's anything to worry about. I still have absolute confidence that Mercedes will be there or thereabouts when it really matters down in Melbourne. Chris Nigel, this is a good one because lots of people are talking about this at the moment. He says there are 2 front wing philosophies. Who do you think is best? Had Merc and Red Bull went to the wrong route, how long it'll take them to modify their cars, knowing they must modify further the car? Merc and Red Bull went for a bigger DRS flap than Mercedes. What are the advantages? All right, well, 2 questions in there, I guess. The first one about the 2 different front wing philosophies, and that's, there's a range within. Ferrari are kind of one extreme of a front wing. Merc and Red Bull perhaps are the other. Merc and Red Bull have gone for this great big, maximising the available area on the flap section, the outboard section of the front wing. Ferrari, Sauber have kind of gone with this very minimalistic design, which perhaps sacrifices some downforce, trying to encourage a better flow condition around the front tyre. Which one's best? I mean, who knows? I don't know. But the point that you must make here is that Ferrari, Sauber and others wouldn't have gone for that design without serious consideration to all other designs as well. They would have undoubtedly looked at the same sort of solutions that Mercedes and Red Bull have looked at, and equally Mercedes and Red Bull, I'm sure, will have looked at the sort of solutions at the other end of the scale. Now, some solutions will work better on certain cars. I don't think it's as straightforward as bolting a Sauber front of Alfa, keep getting it wrong, Alfa Romeo front wing onto a Mercedes or a Red Bull and seeing a great big advantage, or vice versa, because it's about the concept that you've designed into your car. you know, one of those manages the front tyre wake in a very different way to the other, and that affects everything else that goes on further back downstream from that. So it's a conceptual design rather than just a simple bolt-on piece. So it's not as easy to say one's better than the other. One might work better with a particular design concept than the other, and I'm sure we'll see lots of development in that area. So it may well be that even as close as next week in Barcelona for the second test, we might see some teams trying a new version or a different variation on somewhere in that range between either extreme. In terms of DRS flap, Merc and Red Bull went for a bigger DRS flap than Ferrari. I mean, no, they didn't. They're not allowed to do that. So the DRS flap is a standard, very tightly spec'd part. It's 20 millimeters bigger than it was last year, but that is across the board. You're clearly not allowed to just change the size of your DRS flap, because that's a huge performance advantage if you do that. So no, that's not quite the case. I am Colpo says, will you be attending any Grand Prix this year or possibly doing a meetup? I don't know. At the moment, I'm not down to attend any, which is a real shame because I always go to at least half the races, as most of you know. In the past, that's been for Sky most recently. That's not happening as it stands for this season. So I have no actual plans. I still would hope that I'm able to get to some races in one capacity or another. I'm freelance, so I kind of can work for anybody. But at the moment have no plans. But in terms of a meetup, lots of people have asked about this kind of thing, and I've never really considered it before. But if you guys would love to do something like that, then I'm quite happy to try and look into it, because the community we've built on this YouTube platform is so cool, so good. I love you guys so much, and we've built something great together. So that at some point, if we can do a little meetup somewhere, somehow, I'm absolutely well up for that. So it's on the back burner, and I will look into it at some point. Callum Moore says, just a quick question. When raising the car up to wheel it back into the garage, why don't teams use the pit stop jack instead of the awkward regular one? It just seems a bit unnecessary. Well, the simple answer is that the pit stop jack is designed specifically and only for pit stops. That means it lifts the car, the wheels, that much off the ground. No higher than they need to be, just enough to get clearance to get the wheel on and off. It's definitely not high enough to wheel one of the sort of wheelie boards that they put underneath the chassis, underneath the floor, to then manoeuvre the car back into the garage. That's the simple reason. In testing, and of course on race weekends as well, they jack the car much higher up with a standard garage jack. You can slot the wheelie boards in, and then you can swivel the car around and manoeuvre it quite easily into the garage. It's as simple as that. Jason Lee says, hey Mark, do you know if the teams for the first week of testing only used one engine? There's all kinds of talk about exceptional lap counts, but if the engine is changed at night, well, you know what I'm saying. I do know what you're saying, Jason, and the truth is I don't know how many engines were used. There's no restriction in testing, and lots of people have asked, does testing include the maximum number of power units that teams are allowed to use across a season? And no, it doesn't. Totally different set of regulations. Those regulations only kick in when the cars roll out in Australia. So for testing, you are free. There's two schools of thought on this. The teams, the engine manufacturers, will want to put as many miles, real life miles, on-track miles, onto an engine to try and simulate as close as they can to the number of miles that engine will have to do, or that power unit rather, will have to do over the course of a race season. The other, of course, is that if you're still developing your power unit, you might want to start circulating in the latest developments. So, some teams will keep the same engine or same power unit in and run it and keep running it round and round. Excuse the noise of the dogs you probably hear in the background there. And others will want to start cycling in updates and getting track miles on those. They of course run them for miles on dynos back at the factory, but even so there's no comparison, absolute comparison, to real life on-track mileage whilst it's bolted into the back of a car, or with the kind of the dogs sound like Chewbacca over there. I don't know what's going on. The dyno can simulate certain things, but it can't necessarily simulate some of the torsional loads, the stiffness forces that are going through that power unit when it's bolted into the back of an actual chassis. So that's the way that some people look at it. Okay, finally this one from Matthew Butcher. He says, do you think Haas have been given the task of testing the breaking point of the Ferrari engine, or are they just working through their own program and been unlucky with reliability? Absolutely, I think people like Haas, and I'm sure the same will apply to Toro Rosso, will be given the task of doing of doing some of the more let's say mundane reliability stress analysis testing of some of those components. If we're going to get something break, they will want to prove it out in one of those cars rather than the car that they see as being their biggest title hope. So Ferrari will want to maximise their on-track time. If they're starting to push limits with engines and things like that and they need to get track time with those, absolutely it will go in the Haas, possibly even the Alfa Romeo first. And the same, as I say, with Honda and Red Bull and Toro Rosso's relationship. So I don't know the absolute reason for Haas's reliability issues that they had last week. It's not unusual to have unreliability. In fact, it was even unusual to have the level of reliability that we did have last week. So whilst we're talking about perhaps Haas's misfortune or the odd occasions where they broke down, actually that's pretty normal, and it's just the fact that everyone else seems to have had an amazing first test that we're really highlighting that. So hopefully they'll get over that. Hopefully because when they have run, they've looked pretty good. And the same with Toro Rosso. I forgot to mention Toro Rosso yesterday, on Friday in my kind of testing analysis. They've had a great start, Toro Rosso. I think they're in a really good position, and whilst they might be testing things like power unit components and engine components for Honda and the main Red Bull team, it's also quite interesting to note that they're running two very extremely different aero concepts. So with the same power unit, Red Bull running one type of front wing and therefore concept behind that, Toro Rosso running the opposite end of the scale, so collecting data on both, and that's going to be interesting because one of those probably will end up being the optimum, or will end up being an optimum solution. And so, you know, we'll see probably if one of those teams starts to switch towards the other's solution, it'll prove that one of those seemed to be better around that chassis configuration. So that's going to be one to watch. Right, thanks guys, really appreciate all the questions. Keep them coming. I love all your questions, and even if I haven't answered them in the video, I always try and answer as many as I can in the comments section or online, so please keep them coming. I hope you have a great day, great evening, and enjoy the second test. I'm actually away this week a lot doing some filming. I will try and keep videos coming, but they may be slightly more sporadic than normal, but don't let that stop you getting involved in the comments section. Give the video a like, thumbs up if you've liked it, hit subscribe if you're not already, and tell your mates. Don't forget to share this around. Let's build the community bigger than it already is, and let's continue in the same vein. But looking forward to this second test. We're going to see some answers as to who's quick and who's not by the end of the week.